The courtroom was filled with whispers, laughter, and disbelief. A young man stood up, his voice trembling but firm. "Let my father go, and I will lift you up." The judge smirked. The crowd burst into laughter. Nobody believed a word he said, but what happened next would silence the entire room and mark that day forever. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any inspiring stories like this one. The air inside the courtroom was tense, yet filled with arrogance. The judge leaned back in his chair, amused by what he had just heard. Lawyers exchanged glances as if mocking the young man's faith. Every eye in the room turned toward him, some curious, some scornful. His father sat in chains, exhausted and hopeless. Years of injustice had weighed on him like a mountain. His hands shook, not from fear, but from weakness. Across the room, officials whispered, "He's lost it. Who does he think he is?" The young man's heart pounded. Yet deep inside, there was a quiet certainty. He wasn't speaking out of pride. He was speaking out of something greater, unshakable faith. The judge cleared his throat and said, "Are you serious? Do you even understand where you are?" The young man didn't flinch. He raised his head, locked eyes with the judge, and said, "Yes, and I also know who stands with me." The judge's mocking smile slowly faded as the young man stepped forward. The guards hesitated, unsure whether to stop him. His calm presence contrasted with the arrogance that filled the room moments before. "I'm not here to argue with your laws," he said, his voice steady. "I'm here to speak truth. Let my father go, and you will see a power that no courtroom can deny." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Some scoffed louder, others leaned in, curious despite themselves. The young man knelt beside his father, placing a hand on his trembling shoulder. His father's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough of this nonsense," he shouted. But deep down, even he felt a chill crawl up his spine. There was something different in that young man's tone, something that couldn't be dismissed as a simple outburst. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you realize the seriousness of your claim?" he asked. His voice echoed through the chamber. The young man met his gaze without fear. "Yes," he replied calmly, "and I stand by every word." The prosecutor stepped in with a smirk. "Your Honor, this is clearly a spectacle. He's trying to turn this courtroom into a stage for his beliefs. Let's end this." Laughter broke out again among some spectators, but others began to grow uneasy. The atmosphere was shifting. The young man turned to the crowd and spoke clearly. "You may laugh now, but when truth is revealed, even the proud will fall silent." His father looked at him with trembling lips. "Son, what are you doing?" The young man gently squeezed his hand. "Trust me, father, this is not about me. It's about the one who never fails." A hush spread through the room. For the first time, the judge didn't laugh. He simply stared, as if weighing something far greater than the case before him. The young man took a deep breath, stepped into the center of the courtroom, and raised his voice with authority. "Let my father go," he said slowly, "and I will lift you up." The words echoed through the chamber like a strike of thunder. The laughter stopped abruptly, every eye fixed on him. The judge frowned. "Lift me up? Are you threatening this court?" "No," the young man answered. "I'm declaring what will happen. If you set him free, You will witness a power that doesn't come from me. It will happen right here, before everyone." The prosecutor scoffed. "Enough of this madness." But the guards, who once stood firm, now exchanged uncertain glances. The father lowered his head, whispering a prayer. The young man didn't move. He stood firm, unwavering, like a pillar in the middle of a storm. The atmosphere thickened. It felt as if something invisible had entered the room, something stronger than fear, louder than mockery. For the first time, silence ruled the courtroom. The judge leaned forward, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "If what you say is true," he said slowly, "then prove it. But know this, if nothing happens, both of you will face the consequences." The young man didn't flinch. "I'm not here to prove anything to you," he replied. "The proof will speak for itself." The room grew colder. People whispered nervously, wondering what would happen next. Some believed he had gone mad. Others, though they couldn't explain why, felt their hearts pounding faster. The judge slammed the gavel. "Guards, unchain the prisoner. Let's see this miracle he speaks of." The chains rattled as the father was brought to the center of the room. His legs were weak, his body frail. He had been unable to stand for months. "Go on," the judge said mockingly. "Lift me up." The young man closed his eyes. In that instant, the courtroom seemed to fade. All the noise, all the doubt, it vanished. It was just him, his father, and the presence of something divine filling the room. The young man knelt beside his father, placing both hands gently on his frail legs. His voice lowered, not to speak to the court, but to the one he trusted above all. "Father in heaven," he whispered, "let your power be known here, not for my glory, but so that every mocking heart may see who you are." The silence in the courtroom was heavy. Every eye was fixed on the two figures at the center, a weak, broken man and a son filled with faith. He looked into his father's tearful eyes. "Stand," he said softly. His father shook his head, trembling. "I can't." "Yes, you can," the son replied, his tone firm but tender. "Not by your strength, but by his." Slowly, the young man began to lift his father's arms. A faint gasp spread through the room as the father's legs, once powerless, started to straighten. His feet pressed against the floor, as if strength were flowing back into him. People leaned forward, wide-eyed. The judge's confident smirk disappeared completely. The courtroom was no longer laughing. It was witnessing something beyond explanation. The father's knees, once fragile and lifeless, locked firmly beneath him. His trembling hands gripped his son's arms, not out of weakness anymore, but out of astonishment. A murmur swept through the crowd, first disbelief, then awe. One woman gasped aloud, covering her mouth. A guard instinctively stepped back, his eyes wide. The father rose slowly, fully upright for the first time in years. The chains at his wrists clinked softly, but the real sound filling the courtroom was the collective gasp of those who witnessed it. The young man stepped aside, allowing everyone to see. "This," he declared, "is not by human hands. This is the power of God." The judge sat frozen, gripping the edges of his chair. His mockery had turned into silent shock. The prosecutor stared, unable to speak. For the first time, the courtroom was united, not in laughter, but in awe. Tears streamed down the father's face. "I'm standing. I'm really standing," he whispered, his voice breaking. The young man nodded, his eyes glistening. "I told you, Father, he never fails." The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a stunned wave of emotion. Some people fell to their knees. Others covered their faces as tears streamed down. Even the most skeptical spectators couldn't deny what they had just witnessed. The judge's gavel slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a hollow echo. His once proud posture collapsed into disbelief. His eyes darted between the standing father and the unwavering son, as if searching for a logical explanation. But there was none. The prosecutor stammered, This isn't possible." His voice cracked under the weight of the moment. The guards, who moments earlier stood firm and skeptical, lowered their heads in quiet reverence. The air was thick, charged with something far greater than human understanding. The young man looked around the room. "You laughed," he said calmly, "but today you have seen the living God move." Not a single person dared to interrupt. The atmosphere had shifted from ridicule to holy silence. It felt like the entire room was standing on sacred ground. The judge slowly rose from his seat, his hands trembling. Moments ago, he was the highest authority in that room. Now, he stood before something he couldn't control, explain, or ignore. He stepped down from the bench and walked toward the father and son. Each step echoed loudly in the silent courtroom. When he reached them, he stopped, his voice breaking. "I mocked you," he said softly. "I mocked your faith, but what I saw today is beyond any law, beyond any argument." The father, still standing firm, looked the judge in the eyes. "This wasn't to shame you," he said gently. "It was to show you the truth." The judge lowered his head. "Release the prisoner," he commanded. The guards quickly unlocked the chains, which fell to the floor with a metallic clang that sounded more like freedom than restraint. Tears welled up in the judge's eyes. "Forgive me," he whispered. The young man placed a hand on his shoulder. "Forgiveness is already waiting for those who believe." The once mocking judge fell to his knees, overcome by the weight of what he had witnessed. The courtroom that began in laughter ended in reverence. The atmosphere was unlike anything the courtroom had ever experienced. The place where sentences were spoken and lives were broken had now become the stage for a miracle. People who came out of curiosity were now weeping openly. Lawyers who had prepared sharp arguments found no words to speak. Guards who once stood in rigid authority now stood in silent awe. The father embraced his son tightly, their tears mingling. "I thought I'd never see this day," he whispered. The son replied, "It was never about what we could do. It was about what he would do." One by one, spectators approached the father and son. Some to ask questions, others simply to touch the man who now stood on his own 2 feet. The miracle had shaken everyone to their core. Outside the courtroom, the news was already spreading like wildfire. Witnesses ran to tell their families what they had seen. A man stood up after years. "Right there in the courthouse," they said, their voices trembling with excitement. The walls that once echoed with accusations now carried whispers of faith. This was no longer just a legal hearing. It had become a divine encounter. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the courtroom walls. Newspapers ran headlines about the unexplainable event. Reporters tried to frame it as coincidence, but every eyewitness told the same story. Something supernatural had happened that day. People who had laughed began to question their hearts. Some returned to the courtroom days later, just to stand in the place where it all unfolded. For many, it wasn't just a story. It was the beginning of a personal awakening. The judge, once proud and skeptical, began visiting the father and son in private. He asked questions about faith, forgiveness, and the power he had witnessed. Slowly, his hardened heart softened. The prosecutor who had mocked the son couldn't sleep for nights. The image of the father rising replayed in his mind over and over. Eventually, he sought out the young man to understand what had happened. The father, now walking freely, became a living testimony. Wherever he went, people listened. His story carried weight, not because of eloquent words, but because his very life was proof. The son never claimed glory. He simply said, "All honor belongs to God. He just allowed me to be part of the miracle." The miracle didn't end in the courtroom. It ignited hearts across the city. Weeks later, the judge stood before a small crowd, not in his robe of authority, but as a humble man. His voice was different now, no longer filled with control, but with conviction. "I once believed power came from this seat," he said, pointing to the judge's bench behind him. "But that day, I realized true power comes from above. I mocked faith, and faith humbled me." Among the audience sat the father and son, smiling quietly. They hadn't sought revenge. They had allowed grace to speak louder than any argument. The judge continued, "That moment changed me. It wasn't just a miracle for a man to walk again. It was a miracle for a man like me to finally kneel." His confession moved many. People who once respected him for his authority now admired him for his humility. His transformation became a living testimony that no heart is too hard for the truth to break through. When he finished speaking, the judge walked toward the father and son and embraced them. The crowd rose to their feet, not in applause, but in reverent silence, as if witnessing the continuation of something divine. Months passed, but the impact of that day never faded. The father walked with strength wherever he went, often stopping to encourage strangers with his story. People who had once pitied him now looked to him for hope. The son continued his life quietly, never seeking fame. But everywhere he went, doors opened. Communities invited him to speak, not because of who he was, but because of the undeniable power that had been displayed through his faith. The judge began hosting gatherings inside the same courtroom, not for trials, but for testimonies. People from every corner of the city came to share how their lives had been touched since the miracle. The courthouse had transformed into a place of restoration. Families reconciled. Hearts were healed. What started as laughter and mockery had become a movement of faith that reached far beyond the walls of justice. The young man often stood at the back of the room during these gatherings, watching silently. He didn't need recognition. He had witnessed the glory of something far greater than himself, and that was enough. Years later, the story of that day was still told, whispered in homes, preached in gathering, shared between generations. It wasn't just remembered as a miracle. It was remembered as the day faith silenced laughter. The father lived a long and full life, walking with strength and joy. Every step he took was a reminder of what happened in that courtroom. People who saw him would often stop and say, "You're the man who stood that day. and he would smile and reply, "No, God lifted me." The judge, transformed by grace, spent the rest of his days using his position to bring justice with humility and compassion. His name became a symbol of redemption, proof that even the proudest hearts can be changed. The son grew older too, but his fire never dimmed. Whenever people asked how it happened, he would simply say, "I believed," and he moved. And so the story lived on, not just in memories, but in lives transformed. What began as a moment of mockery became a legacy of faith, echoing across time. Have you liked, shared, and subscribed yet? If this story touched you, spread it so others can feel this same hope. This story is more than an unforgettable miracle. It's a reminder that faith has the power to shift atmospheres, silence doubt, and transform even the hardest of hearts. What happened in that courtroom didn't stay confined to four walls. It became a spark that lit up countless lives. When the world laughs at faith, keep standing. When circumstances seem impossible, remember the one who makes the impossible bow. If this story moved you, make sure you've liked, shared, and subscribed to the channel. Let more people hear stories that awaken hope and remind us that miracles still happen today.